Good afternoon, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the topic of reentry programming by and for formerly incarcerated folks. My name is Aisha Biswas, and I am a staff member at the Residential College at the University of Michigan. The RC is a four-year liberal arts program and living learning community within U of M. You can learn more about us at the website linked in the chat. We are excited to be able to continue our longstanding tradition of offering teach-ins on important topics now in a virtual format. Today's webinar is presented in conjunction with an RC summer course titled Restorative Justice, Prison Reform, Abolition, From Theory to Practice. Students in this course, taught by Becca Pickus, who you'll be meeting shortly, complete weekly readings, written assignments, and hear from different presenters every week. Some quick notes before we dive into today's topic. Closed captioning is available and can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all captioning may not be 100% accurate since auto transcription is being used. You'll notice that the chat is disabled for participants, but we encourage you to submit questions that you'd like to ask by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, we may not be able to get to everyone's questions. I'm seeing now we have almost 30 people in the room, but we'll do our best to make sure as many relevant topics are touched upon as possible. Feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation, and please be respectful in your submissions. If you'd like to report any technical issues, feel free to also use the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to assist you. Upon leaving the webinar today, you'll be linked to a brief survey which we would appreciate if you could fill out. This webinar is also being recorded. In a few days, you'll be sent a follow-up email with the recording, as well as additional resources from our presenters. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Becca Pickus. Becca is a lecturer in the Social Theory and Practice program in the Residential College. She began working in Michigan prisons in 2008, and she currently teaches classes through the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, the Prison Creative Arts Project, and co-facilitates a restorative justice class with and for incarcerated men at the Macomb Correctional Facility. Becca is also a clinical social worker with a focus on trauma, grief, and loss, and is passionate about working at the intersections of racial justice, restorative justice, and trauma-responsive practices. So with that, Becca, I'll hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you so much for all your support with this series and for that introduction. And welcome everybody to the fourth and final panel discussion in our decarceration activism speaker series. Some of you have been here for the whole ride and others are just joining today. Either way, it's so wonderful to have you, and I'm really excited for you all to learn with and from our amazing panelists today. Really quick, the structure of today's panel discussion. We'll spend about 40 minutes having a discussion with the panelists with some predetermined questions, and then we'll transition, and for the last 40 minutes, we'll respond to the questions that you all submit using the Q&A chat function as Aisha described. So you can submit those questions now or at any point during the event today. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce our amazing panelists today. So first, we have Erin Suganuma. Erin is the Reentry Coordinator at the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office. In 2015, Erin founded A Brighter Way, where he served as Executive Director until 2020, earlier this year. Erin has worked as a prison-based substance abuse counselor, is an executive board member for the Youth Justice Fund, and served as the coordinator for Nation Outside for 3 years. Erin completed his associate's degree while serving 4.5 years in prison. After his release in 2009, Erin earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees in social work from Eastern Michigan University. Thanks for being here, Erin. I'll also mention for those of you who were at the panel last week, you saw Cosine Welch. So Cosine Welch is the current executive director of A Brighter Way. And so Erin founded that organization and Cosine took over the executive director position back in February. All right, secondly, we have another Erin Kinzel. Erin Kinzel is the executive director of the Youth Justice Fund, which is a Washtenaw County-based nonprofit that assists returning citizens who were sentenced to prison as youth with services and resources necessary to ensure human dignity and full participation in their communities. In addition, Erin is a lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Welcome, Erin. And then last but certainly not least, we have Angie Jackson. Angie covers the challenges of formerly incarcerated citizens as a reporter with the Detroit Free Press. She is a corps member with Report for America, which is a program that places journalists in local newsrooms across the country to report on undercovered issues. Prior to joining the Free Press in 2019, Angie worked at newspapers in Charleston, South Carolina, Grand Rapids, and Traverse City. Welcome, Angie. All right, y'all, so let's jump in. So our first question is, what is your current or perhaps also previous work with Reentry, and how did you initially get involved with that work? So how about Erin Suganuma, will you start us off?
Sure, thanks, Becca. Hello, everybody. So my path to this work, actually, first off, I should say, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. We were having some audio issues earlier. So it's been an interesting path to this work. You know, as you heard, I'm formerly incarcerated. Didn't just start as an adult. You know, I had a lot of issues with juvenile delinquency, addiction. I was heavy into substance use from, you know, age 11 or 12 up until the time of my incarceration and throughout my incarceration as well. You know, I went to prison when I was 22, and one of the things that eventually when I started to get my bearings that I just noticed, you know, time after time, it's like I'm in this space with all these people who are essentially being warehoused, you know, and one of the other things that it just kept screaming out to me is like, the system has failed. You know, because for so many people, you know, I came, you know, from a middle-class background and there were a lot of challenges in my life, but for, you know, the system could have been better by me, and certainly systemically failed at so many levels, so much more deeply for so many of the other people who I was incarcerated with. But regardless, you know, it just pointed me in the direction of, you know, this doesn't make sense from a human perspective, intergenerationally. It doesn't make sense from an economic perspective. It completely doesn't make sense. You know, I had experienced instability for years previous to my incarceration, but basically I came out in this space where if I was lucky enough to be able to find a way to be able to get stable, I wanted to be able to help positively impact the system. And so I, clawed tooth and nail to work on myself, to push through negative self-image and kind of stigma. I depended heavily on my support system, which I'll talk about later, in terms of recovery, in terms of academics, in terms of professional growth. When I was about to graduate with my master's degree, I got involved with Nation Outside, which is a grassroots organization dedicated to getting the voice of formerly incarcerated people at the policymaking table. I also started A Brighter Way to create pathways for support for people who didn't have the right family, weren't convicted of the right crime, or whatever else, or were into religion. Basically the idea was we can get support to people regardless of anything. I'm currently the reentry coordinator for the Washtenaw County Sheriff. I started earlier this year. My primary tasks, right now I'm working on getting a lot of the programming, whether it's substance abuse programming, MRT, education, and GED programming back in. I'm coordinating all that. I'm working on a Second Chance Act grant that is partially funded by the Washtenaw County Mental Health Millage. We're hiring 2 case managers and peers. We're going to build a continuum of care for anybody who's been in the jail for. Actually, I'm going to be working with interns to try from Eastern starting next semester to try to get in contact with just about everybody who goes through the jail. And then we're going to have a reentry services team that's going to be building a continuum of care for people while they're in jail and out into the community for probably up to 6 or 9 months. That's going to launch early next year. We've also got a housing program related to that. I'm also working with a few groups on collecting root cause data so that we can better inform jail-based programming and available programming around the county, so that we can catch some of this stuff before, so that people ideally don't end up coming here, which is where I'm at right now. I'm in jail. So that's what I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Why don't we go to our second Aaron Kinzel.
Hi, Becca. So I've got really interesting way to really backtrack this. So my experiences with reentry probably go back close to 40 years. I'm 41 years old, so that's going to be kind of weird. What did I have to do with reentry as a little child or a little toddler? I watched a lot of people in my community, returning from prison, particularly in my household. So my father, who I never met, was in prison. Many of the men that my mother was with had recently been released from prison or off their, on their way to the penitentiary because they were actively involved in criminality. So this has really weirdly been a lifelong process for me in a really scary way since my, conception. Prison and reentry stuff is just really part of my DNA, for better or worse. But more practically speaking, I think with reentry, when I've become more of a reentry professional, was after I served half of a 19-year sentence. At the age of 18, I was incarcerated for a violent confrontation with law enforcement, which instead of me earning a diploma like the normal kids do at that age, I earned myself this, large stint in the penitentiary. So I ended up serving almost 10 years straight. So 18 to 28, I come home in 2007. And that's when my biggest practical experiences with reentry, begins, because I'm living it. It's, it's my lifestyle. And I'll be honest, it's really scary. And that's not something that a lot of people talk about, particularly men, because we're very hyper masculine, coming out of a volatile environment like the penitentiary. We have this hyper masculine persona. We come out of aggressiveness, and we don't want to talk about, our feelings or emotions, or that, in reality, we're just kind of scared little boys that went through a really bad experience. So I struggled as I first came out, and I think that's what built upon my professional development to be a reentry service provider, is that all the mistakes I made my first few years out while on parole, it's kind of helped me build a grid line and a map of how I can actually help people now, because particularly with trauma-informed care, I was never offered trauma-informed services. I have PTSD to this day, 13 years later. And I think that's the biggest missing component for reentry services, which when they are available, which is rare, in my personal and professional opinion, are not very structured well to focus on trauma as a lens that, you know, if you can't deal with yourself coming out of society, you know, prison into society, how the hell do people expect you to, you know, get housing, a job, and maybe further educational attainment when you can't even get yourself right or your connections to other human beings or family members? So, like Aaron, I didn't earn an associate's in prison, but I did get some college work inside. But as soon as I was released, part of my reentry plan was to just go into academia. I got my associates, bachelor's, and master's all in less than 4 years straight. And you say, and you think like that might be a success, but again, in reality, I really don't think that that is a success, because other parts of my life were falling apart. I was married, I had a daughter. I ended up getting a divorce because of all my internal problems and not getting the support that I needed. And now my daughter lives in France because the woman I married was a French immigrant. So now, like, that became compounded trauma for me. Now my family has been broken apart because in a major piece of that is because of the experiences I had in the system. So fast forward, learning from those experiences, I started working on my doctorate. I'm ABD right now for a doctorate in education, and as the executive director of the Youth Justice Fund. And over the last few years, I've been deeply involved in policy and reentry initiatives as a consultant. But what I'm doing at YJF to kind of bring it full circle now is that all of our reentry program I'm helping to redesign is very trauma informed. And that is like the major lens that I'm trying to create. I'm just finishing up a trauma-informed summer camp that we had in Northern Michigan. We had, I think, 18 to 20 participants. And it was just a beautiful experience. Like, it was very enriching, but also emotionally devastating to me, because I'm hearing the stories from people that went through crazy stuff like me as a child in the system. But it's also healing and transformative simultaneously. So I think, you know, that's what we need to look at for reentry initiatives. How do we, you know, focus more on some of the trauma stuff? And Angie, who's on the call, I really appreciate. She actually came up and covered a lot of this, so she may have a different lens of like how some of our participants that talk to her, you know, about their experiences from it. So I'll leave it at there.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And you said you're just leaving a trauma-informed summer camp. You are literally just leaving, like you're in the car outside of the trauma-informed summer camp. So we're so grateful for all of you for making time in the middle of your work weeks, in the middle of doing this incredibly challenging, omnipresent reentry work, to tune in and share your wisdom and experience with all of us. So let's jump now to Angie. You have a little bit of a different role in this as a journalist, and we'd love to hear about your work with reentry.
Great, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with Aaron and Aaron. You two both do such important work in the community, and I'm just humbled to be a part of this conversation. So as a journalist, I report about returning citizens and other people who have convictions in Michigan, or who have been sent to prison. But my role is to really uplift the voices of people who are coming home from prison. So it's my duty to make sure that the stories about the people I write about are done with care and nuance. I need to shine a light on the issues that affect people coming home from prison, whether those are laws or policies. And then most importantly, I need to make sure that the stories I write about are useful to people coming home from prison. So when someone reads the Free Press and sees an article with my name on it, I want to make sure that the information is useful to them. And so with that, I want to make sure that I report not only about returning citizens, but also for them. This is a reporting beat that the Free Press created in June of 2019, so I've been here since this time. I think it's pretty unique for a newspaper to focus on reentry in this way. And as Becca mentioned, I'm here thanks to a program called Report for America, which places reporters in newsrooms across the country to focus on these types of beats. Before I started this, I was mainly writing about crime and courts coverage, so I was pretty much focused on the very front end of the system. And I hadn't done too much reporting on reentry itself. But I have to say that over the past year or so that I've been here at the Free Press, this reporting has been so meaningful and so important me, excuse me, because of all the people who I've gotten to meet through this reporting. I've met returning citizens who are so intelligent, they are smart, they are hardworking, they want to be a part of this community, and they are important parts of this community. So I think it's my job as a journalist to show my readers over and over that people have value after prison.
Thanks so much, Angie. And I remember when we first met, I think you must have just moved back to this area, and I'm not sure how we got in touch, but you came in and you attended the closing ceremony for the Restorative Justice class at Macomb.
Yes.
And it was such a joy to meet you, and I knew that you were going to be such an incredible voice, such an incredible outlet for these voices, because there you were in the prison day one, talking to all the guys and clearly just seeking to celebrate their incredible wisdom and accomplishments. And I know you also mean so much to the families of folks who are incarcerated in uplifting those voices as well. So it's good to have you.
Thanks.
All right, y'all. So let's move on to our next question, talk a little bit, you've mentioned some of these. Let's talk a little bit about the barriers that folks face coming home. And then subsequently, we'll think about the resources and the programs and the ways you all are working to attend to these barriers. So maybe go back to Aaron Suganuma, some of the obstacles and barriers that returning citizens face.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So there was a submitted question that, and I'm going to partially answer that. You know, I did an episode for the PCAP podcast, and I talked about being overwhelmed in a store. And I'm thinking also about the answer that Aaron Kinzel just gave, you know, about being kind of like enculturated in a certain way. You know, there's a way that I was enculturated prior to my incarceration. There's a way that I was enculturated while I was incarcerated. How certain things were really reinforced. And then all of a sudden, you know, not everybody does this, but I paroled to Ann Arbor, which, you know, has a lot of, I mean, it's a nice place to parole in a lot of ways. But one of the other things, like I had this experience on my first day out, or yeah, second day out, trying to get my license or whatever, go to Secretary of State. Anyway, I'm not going to tell the whole story now. Check out my podcast. No, but because I want to give a more specific answer here. But that being said, you know, I was just trying to use the restroom in a store, and I found myself overwhelmed. You know, but basically, I came from a mindset. I was reinforced in a mindset, and now all of a sudden, I'm somewhere else, and I feel like felon is just like tattooed on my forehead. And I couldn't shake it. And it was, you know, scary to ask people for help. And, you know, and that was my second day. My first day, something else happened that I think is even bigger, you know, which is that I was incarcerated long enough, and most people, I mean, it seems like almost everybody else is incarcerated longer than I am. I'm this tiny little meatball or whatever. But I was incarcerated long enough to get to know people, and to start to talk about plans with them, and then to see some of those people get out, hope the best for them, be scared, be jealous, be, you know, whatever, and then see some of those folks come back. And then to know that everybody, despite their best intentions, were back, you know. And I had gotten to a point where, you know, and when I asked them what happened, it's just like, you know, it's the same stuff. And I'm just thinking, like, how could it be the same stuff? You know, and so I created some plans for afterward, you know, plans that I'd made plenty of times before, and I'm used to not following through on. But in this case, like, I really wanted to follow through on something different. You know, there's this part of me. And then something crazy happens. When you open that gate, you know, PTSD, it's my understanding that PTSD affects the amygdala, right? So it affects this part of the brain that's fight or flight. Same part of the brain that's affected by substance use disorder, right? And so I have abnormal or you know, abnormal reactions to different stimuli. And so opening the gate, I started experiencing different, you know, anxieties and all that kind of stuff. Coming back down US 23, I started seeing like Brighton Center for Recovery. I remember failing out of treatment and relapsing within hours of getting out, you know, all this kind of stuff. I saw a lot of sights, smells started coming back. Sensory memories were triggering me and taking me to a place instantly where I just started feeling helpless and remembering how sick I was and remembering how desperate I was and, you know, being in this kind of survival kind of spot. And I think that I got really lucky, you know, because I got really lucky because I was able to connect with recovery in that way, kind of getting to part of my first answer. You know, I was able to qualify to be able to plug into a recovery network for support. But for a lot of folks, and myself included, like technology, I basically returned what was it? It was an iPod Touch because it wasn't even a Touch, it was an iPod. I returned it because I thought it was broken. The reason why I thought it was broken is because I didn't know how to use a touch screen. I thought, like, anyway, you know, like there's so many just basic things that I just didn't get. Socialization, trauma, you know, coming back up, coming to grips with time lost. You know, like Aaron said, like we're not, I don't know where he was locked up, you know, and it is true. It's a hyper-masculine space, but also it's a space where, you know, I was in a cube for a year and a half with these guys that, you know, they basically said, and it wasn't like an every night thing, so I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but they said, man, like everybody turns towards the wall and just cries and pretends that they're sleeping. Like that's just a thing, you know, but we don't know how to actually deal with it, not in the real world. And then when you get out in front of other people, it's a different spot, you know? And so I think the biggest barriers are those internal things. It's learning how to ask for help. It's learning how to be vulnerable. I don't even know what my deficits are, because when you get back to that fight or flight spot, that trauma spot, you know, whatever it is, we're talking about people being, not everybody, but a lot of people just being stuck like a deer in the headlights. And I don't have a label to be able to describe what's going on or what I even need help with. All I know is that I feel overwhelmed. I think that that's one of the biggest challenges. People make a lot of big plans and then all of a sudden they find themselves in the headlights and they don't know what to do, so.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Aaron. I'm just touched by your courage and your vulnerability. And I've had the privilege to know you for about 10 years. And I've been touched by your courage and vulnerability that entire time. So thank you so much for being here. Aaron Kinzel, do you want to add in about the obstacles and some of the challenges facing folks coming home?
Yeah, sure, Becca. I mean, it's really complicated, but like to try to sum it up, I reiterate a lot of the stuff Aaron just mentioned, but like when I think of this, I come at it from two lenses, like, you know, as an academic and also as someone that's kind of experienced this, you know, individually. There's a very big divide between internal and external barriers for people coming out of the penitentiary. And I think the internal factors are the ones that are more profound, but they're also less likely to be addressed, particularly from reentry services. So I think that's the biggest one. So, and then, you know, secondary to that are the external factors, which most of us have all heard about, you know, barriers to employment, you know, housing. Not that those are not minimal, but like I really think they are secondary compared to the internalized trauma that we've never dealt with. So, and to pull it further, like it's not just trauma in prison. That's like something we were talking about at this camp, and all the clients I work with is that when you work with people from prison, their trauma didn't start day one when they entered the penitentiary or when they left. Okay, their trauma is so deeply rooted, and I use myself as an example, but I'm not unique in the spectrum of people I've worked with over the years that have been incarcerated, is that my trauma started when I was conceived, when my mother was raped. Okay, and then as a little boy, watching violence in the home, being subjected to violence, watching my mother get brutalized, watching people get murdered in my community. At the age of 8, my stepfather beat me within a pulp and pulled a gun on me and tried to murder me. He shot at me 6 times from a firearm. And a lot of that is all internalized. And then it just becomes bigger and bigger to where I went from this broken little boy who was in fear and insecurity and not knowing anything to eventually violence begets violence. And I became aggressive and angry and violent, to not because I wanted to hurt people or because I was a bad person, because I didn't want to be fucked with no more. I was tired of being a victim. I was tired of watching my mother get brutalized. So I had no choice. I guess I had a choice, but the choice I made was to end that violence. And to end that violence, I had to become violent in order to protect myself. And again, I'm not unique. thousands of people I've worked with over the last 10 years, all tell me the same damn story. And it's scary and it's just insane, you know, what happens to children, because that's where the trauma started, you know, these adverse childhood experiences. And then that gets compounded in the prison system, because that was never addressed. And then all the trauma in the prison system, the violence, the lack of resources, lack of education, lack of meaning and purpose becomes compounded as we're released from the system. And then, like, you know, like Aaron mentioned, like, that was my biggest thing. I remember my first day coming home. Never had this happen in my life, but maybe some participants in this call know, like, what a panic attack is. I get out of prison, I go to Walmart with my wife then, and I'm like sensory overload, like all these colors and smells, and like I start to like cry, and like my heart starts beating. I'm sweating for, like, I don't know what she's telling me, go pick this, go do that, and like I'm like, I don't know what the hell to do. I'm just overwhelmed, and my heart rate, I'm like feeling like I'm having a heart attack. And she actually takes me to the ER because she didn't know what was, and I didn't know what was happening to me. I really thought there was something wrong with me, but now I know, reading about, you know, literature and trauma and just seeing this in other people, it's a very frequent occurring phenomenon, that like that's the piece of internalness that we have not addressed, that trauma. And that's, so to shift, that's what we do with the Youth Justice Fund. That's what I do, because I've experienced this, I've read about it, I know it. I partner with clinicians and social workers like Aaron Suganuma, because I'm not a clinician. I'm not a psychologist, but I am someone who has lived this. I'm a professional, and, you know, my area of expertise is like policy, corrections, but education. So I develop curriculum with the help of clinicians to wrap around services to kind of help people. So that's the internal piece. So now shift to the external stuff. So it's not just the barriers, but it's the purposeful, policy-oriented, tough-on-crime rhetoric that we've had for 50 years that is a major barrier for people coming out of the penitentiary. So the collateral consequences of conviction, I mean, you've got like close to 50,000 laws that say you cannot do A through 49,999 because you have a criminal history. And that's not a broken criminal justice system. That's a very well-oiled machine that's designed for a very intent purpose to marginalize, oppress, and control certain populations, which happen more often than not to be, you know, people of color. You know, it's well designed, and I'm not saying it's right by any means, but I'm just saying that the government has been like plotting this shit for a long time, and we as a society are culpable in allowing this to happen, because very often people sit back and say, you know, well, I voted or I did this and I'm not racist and blah blah, and that's not me over there. No, you are a part of the problem, because you're allowing this perpetuation of corporate control and corruption and the marginalization of certain people in society. So you are culpable for it. I'm even culpable for it, because even though I work to fight this, I'm sure there's more I could do. You know, all of us, I think, have a part of this fight. And I think, like, for us to like really go forward, we need to collectively build power. And it's different people. So it's not just people like me that have been formerly incarcerated. We need people like you, Becca, that are academics. We need people like Angie that are journalists to like show and share these narratives, so we don't become these convict token sound bites in movies and Netflix, but like we're very much real people that are struggling and want to contribute greatly to society. So I think that in summation kind of hits on, you know, both of those areas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aaron. You gave us so many things to think about. So let's go to Angie now. You know, your beat is covering the challenges of formerly incarcerated folks, and you've worked so closely with so many folks as they've come home. So what are some of the challenges that you've seen?
Yeah, thank you. So when I started this reporting, I wasn't sure what it was that I didn't know about reentry. I didn't know a ton about the challenges that people face on a day-to-day basis. So I created a survey for formerly incarcerated people to fill out online, and a survey that I printed out and brought with me when I met formerly incarcerated people. It probably comes as no surprise that the most common answers that people shared was that they had a hard time finding meaningful employment and finding safe housing. But I think what did surprise me is that people who had been out of prison for, you know, quite a long period of time, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, still felt like they could never really move on from their prison experience because of the way that they're treated out here. So to hear, to see people who I think, have achieved a lot, and to feel like that continues to follow them, I think that was a real eye opener for me, and has really, kind of guided my reporting. And I was, when I think about the barriers, of course there's these obvious barriers that, Erin touched on, employment and housing, but it's like once you take a closer look, there's all these, maybe like tinier things that I might normally think of as someone who has not been, who has not been to prison, has not had to return home. But I think about people who come out of prison and who've been there for 10, 20, 30 years and come out without their state ID. And then what a hurdle it is to get that ID. It's costly, it's time consuming. It's frustrating, and then without that, it's hard to start a job, it's hard to find housing, you can't even cash a check. So these are things that we don't really think about as being people here on the outside who've never had to deal with this. And then there's other things that surprise me, and Becca had shared this story with you about child support. If you owe child support here, and for some reason you are sentenced to prison, if you don't notify the court that you're in prison, you can still be charged monthly for your child support. And then that child support adds up, to this debt where some people leave prison with tens of thousands of dollars owed in child support that they acquired at a time when they were incarcerated, when they weren't working, or if they are working, or if they were working, they were making very little money. Another thing I learned about recently is that in Michigan, if you have 2 felony drug convictions, you don't qualify for food stamps, and that's a lifetime ban on food stamps. And I think, there's so many barriers that I'm learning about, that I'm hearing folks are coming up against, that I had no idea about, and that I think that they probably didn't know about either until here they're faced with them. And these are laws and policies that are really preventing them from getting back on their feet.
Absolutely. Thank you, Angie, for speaking to so many of those. And I know you've all sort of said, there's the ones we all know about: housing, employment, but I encourage you, there might be some folks who maybe even aren't familiar with why it's hard to get housing or why it's hard to get employment. So please feel free to describe some of, what that box is and what these restrictions are as well. But let's also transition now to thinking about what are the strategies and programs that so many of you are involved in. Some of you have founded, initiated, run, that are really working so hard to address these barriers. So Erin Suganuma, do you want to start?
Hi, yes. I started a timer. I feel like I've been just rattling on for a while, so I'm just wasted 10 seconds explaining that. My short story is that, yeah, there is a desire for evidence-based practice to create a one-size-fits-all model that's going to heal all people. And the reality is that trauma doesn't work that way, and people don't work that way, and so we might be able to design general outlines and, that kind of thing that can help to point people in the right direction, but one of the reasons why I started, A Brighter Way, why organizations like the Youth Justice Fund are out there, and is because it's. So I was talking to it's hard not to just dive real deep into this. I was talking to Charles Bell about the school to prison pipeline a few years ago, and he was talking about how so many kids who grow up in Detroit look at Wayne State University and all the institutions down there and see them as never applying to them because because their families and their schools don't educate them and don't support them to be able to have that future, and so I think being able to connect with individuals to be able to show hope, like Angie and Erin were talking about, is so important, to be able to show somebody, and broadcast the message that success is not just possible, but it's very real, and the chances are is that we know people who have been successful, or you could know people, except often, it's the exception of the rule of the person who's just out there, who's successful and out about it after incarceration. Most people just kind of like fade into the woodwork. But that being said, I think psychoeducation is a big thing, not just education, but psychoeducation, helping people to put a label on some of their experiences. I don't often recognize when I'm upset, but luckily with enough education, if my palms start sweating, if I start finding myself talking fast and all that kind of stuff, I can be like, oh, this is what I'm experiencing. And this is 2.5 minutes already. Jeez. So psychoeducation is big, resource navigation is big, social support I think is critical. I love the work that YJF is doing. I love the work that PCAP is doing in Inside Out programs to help plant those seeds of hope on the inside. I'd love to see a statewide network of trained peer reentry supports to help navigate and create resources funded in like a community health worker model. With the without the Pure Michigan campaign going anymore, I'd love to, you know, even just slice off a little bit of some budget somewhere to do a campaign that just normalizes the success of formerly incarcerated people, serve as anti-stigma for the general public, but also to promote hope for people who think that they're out of luck. That's what I got.
Thank you so much, Aaron. You fit a lot in, and I don't know if I can speak for everybody, but I don't feel like you're rambling at all. You're providing so much fantastic information, so thank you. Aaron Kinzel, do you want to talk a bit about programs and services to address these obstacles?
So before I go for, I want to piggyback off two things Aaron said, I think that were extremely important. So peer-to-peer support, programmatic involvement is huge, particularly when you have formerly incarcerated individuals that you're working with. So Aaron and I have both done many things in which, so having us with that lived experience, but not just the fact that, well, we did time in prison, that's great, okay? But the fact that we become professionals and become successful out here, I think that's been really phenomenal in my work, is that we're able to help create a roadmap, like Aaron said, to let a lot of these individuals know that they can become successful. I'll be honest, like, I'm not nobody special. I'm this dumb hillbilly kid that grew up in the projects first, but then out in rural communities. I've just became, you know, a very good hustler and determined, and I just don't like people telling me no. That's the complete honest truth of like my success. And a lot of people invested in me. I cannot take, you know, say like I did all this on my own. It took a village to really make me grow and get rid of some of my ego and a lot of other issues that I had. And I probably still have a little bit of an ego, but like, you know, things that have happened with me has been through a support system. And particularly to have people that when I came home, one of them, for instance, would be Mary Heinen, who was the founder of PCAT. I love Mary dearly. She spent over 25 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections for being there when her husband murdered someone, which is just insane. That's a whole other side note, but like how we treat women in this system is just horrific. It's, you know, the men suffer, but women got it way worse. But anyway, Mary taught me so much about like peer-to-peer mentorship. And then like to talk more to programming, like the healing power of certain things that a lot of people don't think about, like art, for example. Like that's something we've been pushing at the Youth Justice Fund, even at our camp. We had an art therapy session by someone who was actually formerly incarcerated. And she went around and did this really cool thing where everybody was starting to paint something, and then she would like look at that image and like did this almost like tarot card / like psychological profile of people. And like she was like spot on, I think 9 out of 10 times talking, and people were like, wow, how did you, like, someone drew a tree, and then she would be like, well, this hole here represents maybe your family and this tight knit and this grass, but you don't have very good roots, but you want them. Like these are things that are kind of unorthodox, but it's a way to break down barriers and make people comfortable to really push in clinical components that allow people to open up and talk about things that we don't normally talk about, particularly with men, again, who are very reserved. We're emotionally disconnected when we come out of prison. So for us to feel safe and vulnerable and able to share things like that, I think is really powerful. Another point Aaron made, like, it's not a one size fit all. I'm all about evidence-based practices. And I think I've been very purposeful in choosing things that I know are evidence-based. But however, just because something's evidence-based, it doesn't mean it's 100%. And hell, it's probably not even 50% of the time in reality. You know, it's just how people do up research. You never know. But I take things that I feel are good models, and I'm taking this from a holistic approach and say, you know what, I'm going to try these different things. So like one we did today, the other day was art therapy. We also did, you know, a regular counseling session. And here's a new one that I don't think has ever been published anywhere, but like jet ski therapy for a bunch of guys that have been to prison. and some who have never been even on the water or scared to death to drown. I took a man who served 45 years with me on a jet ski that was just terrified, but he says, I'm not going on that thing. He says, Aaron, will you take me out? I'm like, of course I will, bro. Come on. And he was just so uncomfortable, and we talked out there, and like, it was just a beautiful thing. I can't even like describe it. Like, it makes me emotional thinking about it. Like, nature and so many other things that you would think would not be clinical, you know, at their core, but created this environment and this safe place for these men and women to open up and talk about deeply rooted trauma that I think is just, again, I can't emphasize that enough, that internalized barriers that we have stop us from overcoming the external barriers, which are profound and powerful and detrimental. But if we can't conquer ourselves and our own demons, we have no chance at surviving in any of these physical barriers that surround us from a policy lens. So I think like that, and another thing too, like Aaron mentioned, Charles Bell, he's a good friend of mine. He's over at, I believe, Illinois University or Illinois State. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he's a scholar, African-American male, grew up in the city of Detroit. You know, he's seen some things and may have done some things when he was a kid, but like he chose that pathway to success in academia, and he's big on shutting down the school to prison. That's my vision for the future. We not only should we help people coming out of the system, but like I hope to mentor kids as I'm stabilizing all these grown men and women. Phase 2 of this reentry initiative I want to do is that we need to shut off the front end of the pipeline. We need to close off the back end when people are coming out, let them out earlier and give them services that they need and deserve, particularly people that went in as youth. But then like, how can we stop the next kid from picking up, you know, a gun in his community because he's a scared little boy? Or how can we stop, you know, something else happening? How can we get these kids focused on that they can go to school, that they are valued, that they are brilliant little human beings that can do what they want, but they need help and support and they need to be motivated. So I think that's really the future of reentry, is that how do we, you know, push kids forward? And these kids will listen to us, because I'm not going in like you see those scared straight programs where you got a bunch of big convicts that are all, bro, I'm going to get you, boy, and don't come to prison. Those kids ain't scared of that. They've had guns in their faces before. They've seen violence. That ain't scaring them. But they will connect on a deep level when they know someone has walked through their shoes and they look like them. Okay, I mean, I can reach, you know, some young black males because of experiences I had, but I'm not an African-American male. When you got someone that looks like you and talks like you and sounds like you and went the same way you did, that's powerful. And that'll really change not just people, but communities and society as a whole.
Thank you, Aaron. Got to work on the tagline of this, but something you said really stuck on me, like the long-term goals of reentry is no entry. Something like that. That's sort of how we organized the class this summer, as we started on front end thinking about ending cash bail, thinking about defunding the police. We talked about interrupting the school to prison pipeline. That absolutely, I mean, reentry and preventing recidivism and ensuring full healing and integration and success is huge, but the long-term goal is that we never have reentry at all, because we never had entry. So I love that idea. Thank you so much. And Angie, what are some of the programs and responses to challenges that you've been able to see and document in your journalism this past year?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that covering yesterday's trauma summer camp was so powerful. I don't know that I've been to anything that powerful in a long time, that I've witnessed anything that powerful. Seeing the guys on the jet skis for the first time. There's one man, I think he served maybe 30 something years in prison, and he was just out there flying on the water. He said he closed his eyes and just screamed, and he felt free for the first time. And then he said he watched someone else who he had served time in prison with going on that jet ski, and just seeing how happy his friend was very healing for him and the own trauma that he had been harboring. But in terms of reentry programming, I've been thinking myself in my reporting of what makes reentry programs good or helpful. And I feel like they need to be hands-on. I was talking with someone at the camp yesterday about how, you know, she said she's been in reentry, or she's been home from prison since May, and there's a group that gave her money toward her phone bill, but she didn't know how to actually pay her phone bill. So that money that she had is useless if she doesn't know how to log onto her computer and to pay that bill, right? So I feel that the right reentry programs really sit down with people and walk them through that process of here's how you use your laptop, here's how you pay this bill, here's how you sign up for this. And they're done by people who are patient, people who've lived that experience themselves, like Erin and Aaron. And then I think, you know, reentry can come in a lot of different forms, or reentry help can come in a lot of different forms. And so when employers, you know, offer second chances to people, I think it's important that they also offer other help surrounding that too. I was thinking about a feature I wrote about the restaurant, Detroit Street Filling Station, and half of the employees there have been behind bars. They've either, you know, been to jail or prison or have been housed as youth. And so, you know, that's pretty unique for a restaurant to employ, you know, half of its employees being formally incarcerated, but it's done there on purpose because the owner doesn't ask people about their criminal convictions. She doesn't ask about how much time they've spent in prison or why. She just wants to know, are you a hard worker? How do you treat people? Why are you here? And I think that goes a long way, you know, that sort of mindset. And the people I talked to who are employed there said it's a wonderful place for them to work because they feel like, you know, if they have to leave work to meet with their parole agent at a certain time on a certain day, they're flexible with that there. You know, that there's this like understanding of here's where you are in your life and we want to make this easy for you to succeed. And the owner says, you know, she thinks that, you know, other employers should give people second chances, of course, but if you just give them a job, you're pretty much just like setting them up for failure if you don't offer other support around that.
Thank you so much, Angie, for touching upon so many of those other factors, those other needs, and the ways that employers, the ways that programs can respond. That takes information. You know, they have to understand what some of these needs are around scheduling flexibility. It takes an interest in really going against the stigma that somehow suggests that somebody who spent time behind bars for whatever reason shouldn't be employed, and saying, you know, on the contrary, this person has every chance to be an incredible employee, and then partnering with them to make that the reality. So we're gonna transition now and start taking some of the questions that have come in, either when people registered or that have come in over the Q&A. And I wanna start, where do I wanna start? Actually, I wanna start here. This is a question that was aimed towards Erin Suganoma, but please, anyone can jump in if you also have ideas. So Erin, this is a question from one of the students in the class who read your bio and saw that you founded A Brighter Way, and now you work in the sheriff's office coordinating reentry. And so the question is, what are the differences you see between working for a nonprofit organization and working kind of within the criminal legal system? And do you think one is more effective than the other?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's an interesting one. It's one that, man, I feel like I need to close my door all the way. You know, it's an interesting one. It's an interesting one and an interesting time. You know, I started this job and was hired in February, started in March, and then was working from home for a couple months. The first week I was back was the same day or same weekend. I think George Floyd, happened on Memorial Day, as did the incident with the Grady Ills in Ypsilanti. And so we had almost daily protests outside of my job, where a lot of the people who I've been working with previous to working here, you know, were out front protesting. And, you know, and some folks who worked here were out there protesting as well. So I think that's one of the interesting things. You know, I'm working in a space where the last time I was in here, you know, I was sick, detoxing, and headed to prison. You know, and so that's one of the other things too that really shook me for the first little while that I was here, is I'm working in a place where I experienced trauma, and where so many people naturally experience trauma. Actually, right now we're talking about, I was working, communicating with one of the directors here about how we're recreating the booking process and orientation process. I'm putting together a manual with Sarah Stewart from Community Mental Health. That's basically a welcome packet to Washtenaw County Jail. You know, here's what we have in terms of mental health resources reentry resources. Here's some tips for sleeping, self-care, all that kind of stuff. You know, so whether we like it or not, law enforcement, the criminal justice system is the #1 feeder to social service agencies. You know, we're talking about child protective services, we're talking about substance abuse, we're talking about mental health. You know, across the board, we're talking about diversion courts and all that kind of stuff. It would be great if, you know, the best kind of reentry is no entry, right? You know, so that's why I took the job here. It's a step before prison. You know, how can we get people away from that? And so I think that that's why I'm here. In the nonprofit space, I can do advocacy work at the policymaking table. I can push from the outside. We also need people pushing from the inside, because any institution or any individual who's just told you need to be a certain way, if you need to be a certain way, what's your natural reaction, you know? And so the idea here is to get people pushing in the right direction on the inside, and have people, you know, support the work when possible, and keep the work going for people doing it on the outside. You know, I cannot tell. I've messaged you, Angie, about how important your articles are for people. You're exposing light to people who feel systematically and categorically dismissed and unheard, and it's just it's so powerful to see that work. But you know, so you know, in those different ways, you know, the other thing that I experience, and this is no joke, the bureaucracy is insane. In a nonprofit, I can pretty much do anything that I want whenever. Here, it's like, I can't. It's like, can I go to the bathroom? Can you unlock the door, please? It's pretty cool. So, long answer, but yeah, it's a really interesting time to be in this space.
Thank you so much, Aaron. You know, I was just thinking, as you mentioned, texting Angie about the work she's doing, I'm just thinking about how essential it is to have people in all of these different places. And I'm just sitting here reflecting on all the text messages and emails and Facebook messages I have sent the three of you over the past couple of years, because, you know, I teach classes inside, and my students are incarcerated, and they come home and they desperately need reentry services. And that's not where I specialize, but I care deeply about them. And I call you guys on the phone, Aaron and Aaron, or I Facebook message you, or I send an email, and I'm following up with those students a couple months later, and they just say the Aarons took care of me. You know, they got me a car, they're getting me a job. I have a closet for an apartment, but it's mine and it's safe and I'm home. And it just really takes people in all these different stages. And then Angie, especially when COVID hit, I was like, is it rude if I text you every day? Because I got cut off from all my students on the inside. And because of my role as a professor, I'm not allowed to communicate with them outside of class. And so they were turning in papers to me. That's the only contact I could have. And in some of them, they would say, you know, just say things about what were going on. Or one student did, you know, try and just share what his life was like. And I said, tell Angie, I can't respond to this. I'm not allowed to respond to you outside of classwork. I will get kicked out of the system, but tell Angie, because you were already in touch with them. You were already, this is somebody who you've reported on and interviewed, and you've worked with their family. So really just having people in all these different locations who can create these wraparound services and these webs of support, I think is so essential. So I have a question for you now, Aaron Kinzel. And it feeds a little bit off of Aaron Suganuma's last one, thinking about working in different places to do this work. And so this is a question from another student. I had them watch a short documentary about Susan Burton this past week. And so some of you might be familiar with Susan Burton and her incredible book, Becoming Miss Burton, which I wholeheartedly recommend for everybody to read. But in the documentary, it was talking about Susan Burton's challenges with getting funding and how she wasn't eligible for federal funding for a long time for her reentry organization in Los Angeles. And so this student's really curious how the Youth Justice Fund gets funding. And of course, nonprofits, that's one of the big challenges. So Aaron, if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I think I did meet Susan at one time at some event, probably in Washington D.C. I've got her book actually. She signed it for me. I've yet to read it, but I have heard from others that it's rather phenomenal. And yeah, she's definitely come a long way, and I love hearing stories like that of success, Becca. Because again, like I think in me and Aaron too, or like I hate to like tokenize us as like we're the only peoples that are success, because like Aaron mentioned, I think before, like there's so many other people that are doing great work, but they never get the notoriety, or that they're really improving community, not just like doing well themselves or individually with their family, but there's so many people that have been justice impacted that are doing great work, that didn't write a book, that don't run a nonprofit, or are not in more public spaces. They're kind of the shadows of society, but they're still doing great things too. And that's a big thing that I try to do at the youth justice. I want to empower people, and get their voices out there too. But sidetrack, how do we get money? This has been new to me. So I've been trained as an academic. I've been a faculty member for 7 years, started off at Western Michigan and then at University of Michigan. So like, since I got my master's degree, that was actually my first job, by the way, was a professor adjunct. That was really weird. But so like in the last year, I got hired on as the director of the youth. But what I think I brought to the table that they really felt the value is that I have some really innovative ideas. I have management experience and leadership capacity. So how I get money is that I just kind of share my story, but I use it in a narrative that incorporates policy, humanization of formerly incarcerated people, and then the need for these services. So as I talk to foundation officers or private donors, I use myself very often as an example, but not as that like, hey, look at me, I did all these things. What I try to say is that I was just a normal kid that went through some really horrific things and had a really horrible upbringing and lived in an environment. And my story is almost exactly the same as so many other youth that experience those same things. The difference between me and them is this. When I came home, I had, grandparents and family members that invested in me and helped me get a car, helped me find housing, helped me do all. So I had a lot of privilege in that aspect. And I'll be completely honest and frank, the violence and the type of activity I was involved in with my family when I was younger, if I didn't have those services when I went home, we would not be having this conversation unless you guys were paying me from a prison cell or writing on my grave. I'll be very frank with you. So we as a society create these high rates of recidivism by not investing in people. That's I think the most important thing to understand is, and that's what I try to tell private donors and foundation officers, that you are investing not just in people, but in community. So, do you want more people like me and Aaron to come out? It's not that really hard, in all honesty, and it ain't even that pricey. Like, with a few $1,000s, we get people basic transportation, might be an apartment. One gentleman you probably know, I don't want to say his last name, but I'll say his first name, Walter. He's spoken very highly of you. He's a prime example. He's a man that did over I think either 35 or 40 years. I can't remember because everybody's done so much time. But like, we invested in Walter. And by Aaron helping to get him connected to a job, us by helping him get an apartment, both of us having texts and phone calls, and Walter was at this camp crying like the rest of us as we're all bleeding our hearts out together. He's invested in community now. And that took like $5,000 and some phone calls and conversation and just community. That's it. But you know what it costs to incarcerate that man again, because you don't give him opportunity, because you want to push him aside? It's going to cost $40,000 to $50,000 because he's getting older. And the older he gets, it's going to cost more and more, $60,000, $70,000. He's going to die in prison. All because we as a society are too goddamn cheap to invest in human beings. And it makes me sick, in all honesty. I'm sorry to like get off my soapbox here, but like, there is so much more everybody on this call and in society can do to fight the carceral state. And it is so massive. People just think it's the prison system. It's not. There's so many other pieces of it. The carceral state is just a manifestation of capitalism. Capitalism is raping everybody in the world right now and feeding off of us, using us as resources to funnel the machine. This whole pandemic, it just makes me like think it's crazy. But during COVID, actually, we actually got more money, which was actually kind of interesting. So I do have to give props to foundations and other larger nonprofits that have supported the Youth Justice Fund. So without that support and without community support, I think we could have gone under. And I think my board members, I'll look at Aaron for a moment, I think he was probably concerned, like, what would happen, and I was so new. But, like, I think I did pretty well. Given the pandemic and everything, I think since I came on in October, I've raised over $150,000. So in that first 3 months, we didn't get anything. So really that $150,000 is all within the last probably 6-month period. So that's a lot of money and a lot of things that we've done to help people. So I'm really proud of that. And as a side note, www.yjfund.org, Google us at Youth Justice Fund, check us out on Facebook. We made that summer camp happen with only $11,000, and I made that work in a 2-week period with a staff of 2 people. So if people would invest in that, you can change the lives of a lot of human beings by just dropping off 50 or $100, or if you got money, hell, give us 1,000. That'd be great.
Aaron, every time you speak, I'm thinking of all these things that I want to affirm or respond to. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it would take me hours. You share so much, so many important ideas in such a short period of time. We will definitely share links to the Youth Justice Fund. We'll send a follow-up email within the week with the link to recording, and we'll share information about Youth Justice Fund, about A Brighter Way, about any organizations that you all want to highlight. We can share information about Nation Outside, so that the folks on this call can learn more about it. And then if they are able, maybe donate time, money. And also I was so touched when he mentioned Walter. So Walter is so dear to me. He was in my very first Inside Out class. And yeah, he went in at 17 and did 43 years, I think, or about 40 years. And here he was at that summer camp on that lake. Just makes me so delighted. When he came home, he was really struggling because he didn't have that familial support that you were talking about is so essential. And you know, he always dreamt of being a paralegal, and he effectively is a paralegal, but if you don't have a place to live and you don't have transportation and you don't have money to enroll in school and you can't get that paper that certifies you as a paralegal, it's really hard to be hired as one. And I know that he's one of the guys I sent to both of you, and I said, please help, do what you can. And he's emailed me so many times to say how grateful he is for all of the ways you two have helped him.
I'm glad to hear it. Just quick side note on Walter. I love him, Becca. Like, he's really honestly one of my favorite human beings. This is a man that, like, is just so humble, but also you look at him as an older African-American male, you know, you don't have this idea that he is this brilliant scholar, and it's all self-taught. Like, this guy knows case law. He would sit down with me in conversations and tell me all. He's like, you know what happened in the 90s, Aaron, in this case law that happened under USC code, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, Walter, actually, no, I don't. But would you please share that with me and explain? But he's just brilliant. Like, that's the type of people that he's such a good heart, and with a little bit of investment. And I'll tell you this, Becca, I promise you, we're going to put that man in law school. I'm going to find a way to get the money and push Walter to do that, because even though he's a little bit older now, that doesn't mean he can't, you know, continue his education and be like a really great legal team that could do civil rights violations or something like that.
Yeah, I'll just echo that it was very clear to be walking into the classroom, that first class in the prison teaching Inside Out. And, you know, I was the professor theoretically, and I was like, this man's going to keep me on my toes. If I don't know something, Walter definitely does. He has an encyclopedic brain for law and history, and yeah, he should be a lawyer and a professor, and I would take his class tomorrow. All right, let's move to Angie. We have a question that came in for you, and it says, as a journalist, what do you think are the most effective things we can do to decrease stigma and prejudice that formerly incarcerated folks face, and sort of largely speaking, how can we use the media to change the narrative?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked. So I think one of the biggest things that journalists can do is to be intentional about our language. So when I reported on crime years ago, I probably used language that is very different than what I use now. So now I do not refer to people as former offenders or ex-convicts or felons. And as I talk to many returning citizens, you know, I ask them, what do you want to be called? Where are you now? And most people who I talk to prefer, you know, to not be called felon, of course, or offender. And I think that when we use that language, we're kind of, you know, we're kind of saying that people are sort of like stuck in this worst moment of their life, right? And we're always judging them on that. And so I think, you know, language is big. It's something that, you know, I'm working on, and then I hope other journalists are too. It's taking a little bit of time, but I think we're slowly getting better at it as a profession. And also I think, you know, just sharing the complete stories of returning citizens. So I think that goes a long way to have someone's story, to see them in the paper, to see their picture, to see them after prison, not their mugshot, not the photo of them in the courthouse being sentenced to prison, but to see who they are now and where they are now. I think that's really powerful for people who are in reentry, and for people who are not in reentry, but just, you know, wanting to learn more about returning citizens, to show that, you know, yes, this is where they are. This is who you can be. Like Aaron and Aaron, you can be wildly successful and you can help other people. And I think, you know, as consumers of news, to share those stories with people in your networks, your families, your friends, people on social media. As I share the stories that I write, I hear from a lot of people in my life who say, you know, oh, I never considered this being an issue for someone after prison, or, oh, I never thought about it from that standpoint. So I think, you know, the more that we can share those stories and have those conversations, and have, you know, have people who are formerly incarcerated be, to have their stories, you know, uplifted in a way that's positive, I think is huge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Angie. So now we have a question that I think can go to all of you. And the question is, how do you balance empowering returning citizens to seek the resources they need themselves, while simultaneously stepping in and addressing immediate concerns? So maybe we can go back to Aaron Suganuma. You can start thinking about this balance.
So that's one of the interesting challenges, I think, in this work. And if I'm gonna kind of understand the question, it's you know, I think I might be able to show you better than I can tell you. So, so I'm the first reentry coordinator here. Prior to this, the idea of reentry was maybe at best, and this is generally what happens at jail. Actually, I think usually what happens at jail is you just get out. You just have this time, and prisons, you know, you just have this time stamped out of your life, and then they open the door and they say, this is the day you've been waiting for. Go forth and thrive. You know, but the issue with that is that, you know, as we've been talking about, everybody has unique needs. Now, I'm trained as and have been a substance abuse and mental health counselor. So one of the interesting challenges that I have is that, yes, I want to empower people, and self-determination I think is important. And I know that there's probably a lot of social workers on the line too, and you know, it is what it is. But I've got to say this, whatever. Often, you know, people will have these priorities. So at the top of my reentry list, what I've got is this section that says perceived needs. You know, what are some of the things that you know, identify as some of the most important? And then, you know, we have conversations about that. And then we start talking about some of this other stuff, mental health, substance abuse, housing, all this kind of other stuff. Because, you know, for instance, I'm talking to this guy, oh, and are you registered to vote? I was talking to a guy last week who, you know, was saying that his biggest issue was, oh, you know, I think it was like his biggest issue, you know, was getting a job or something like that. But he's got no housing. He's got all his possessions are in an impound yard right now. He doesn't have a way to be able to pay the impound yard. He doesn't have he's got funds that are in an account, the bank is closed, blah, 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 you know. So it comes back to this basic idea that, you know, there's empowering people to be able to self-determine, but there's also having conversations with people to help put things in perspective. You know, because again, you know, my goal when I got out was hopefully, it was simply not to recidivate. Hopefully I could go back to school. Hopefully I could do this other stuff. My experience didn't, if I went by my own experience, I wouldn't be anywhere, you know. But before I could go anywhere else, I needed to figure out how to stay sober. If that makes sense. And that wasn't necessarily the first thing that I was ready to talk about. So that was probably an all over the place answer, but that's what I got.
Well, just for those of you watching from home, the fact that you had that, I don't know if you think of it as an assessment document, but sheet sitting right there, this was not a pre-planned question. So it was clearly on point in terms of the work that you're doing day in and day out. So I don't know if maybe Erin Kinzel, if you want to speak to that a bit too, just in your work with the Youth Justice Fund, these are exclusively folks who were incarcerated as teenagers. So these are individuals who have never been adults in the world, and they come home after 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And how do you balance that need for kind of empowering and agency and meeting immediate needs?
Yeah, it's a great question, Becca, but complex answer. I really like what Aaron does, and I think we have very similar goals. I think we go about things a little differently. So Aaron is very structured and oriented. I am very kind of like, I don't know how to say this. Organized chaos, maybe, in a sense, would be a good terminological. But like, I try to think of things like very holistically. So I don't necessarily have checklists, and honestly, I probably do need checklists and more of a structure and a framework. But like, I try to figure out what people need through conversations, and I've gotten really good as a researcher to really probe and pry and get information out of individuals. And the fact that I've experienced it before and worked with thousands of people in carceral settings or since they've come home, it's been very a blessing for me as well, because I can deeply understand body language, whether or not someone's being, you know, forthcoming or they're nervous or anxious. And a lot of people from prison can put on a really good mask. I'll tell you that right now. It can be, even sometimes, to be honest, manipulative. So to break through that can be kind of a challenge, but I think I do well at that. So I got to get inside their head to figure out what it is they need without me saying, I'm going to break you off a check and help you out. So that's definitely not something that we do at YJFC. Look, oh, we got money. We're going to, you know, here you go. What do you need? I try to like figure that out through conversations. And then I say, all right, well, here's where the agency comes into play. Back. I say, all right, so you've told me these things. So here's some options, you know, but more than me giving them the options, I'm going to work with you. I'm not just going to give you the fish. Now I'm going to teach you how to fish. So here's some money to assist you. Like, for example, getting a, apartment for the first time. I go with all my clients or one of my staff that I've trained. So when they go get an apartment for the first time, I'm right there with them, because like you're right. Teenagers, not only for some of these men and women that come home in their 40s and 50s, there's huge arrested development issues, emotionally, psychologically, and mentally, but like they've just never done this. So imagine a teenager or even a college student on campus. I can imagine the anxiety for them. They don't know how to go get an apartment. Their mom and dad did it for them that are more privileged. But like, imagine people that their whole life has been prison. They don't even know where to start. They don't even understand what a lease is. You know what I mean? So I go and I explain, I read things with them, and I try to like all this legalese stuff, say, this is what this means. A deposit means that, if you don't take care of this place, then you're going to owe more money. You got to just, be very mindful and take care of stuff and stuff like that. And then I work with them through that process. I help them call DTE, get their utilities put on, and tell them like, look, we got to set up a bank account for you. This is how you do this. And here's this app on your, and that's a huge barrier with technology. Oh my God, I could talk 2 hours about technological deficiencies with people that have been up, in the system for decades. They come home to these smartphones. Like, if I didn't have my phone now, my life would shut down. I wouldn't be on this call right now in the middle of nowhere. But imagine people that have never had that experience where they can't pull up an Excel sheet or a database. My YJF client files are in here. I've got, tens of thousands of documents that I got to like shift through and search for. None of that would be available, to me. So they don't understand how to navigate these systems. And I mean, like that as a it's hard to teach people those skills. So sometimes I got to defer to others because I've got other things going on. But like, if I can't do it personally, I find someone that can sit down and show someone how to open a laptop up. How do you get a Word document open? How do you get an email? All of these basic necessities that all of us take for granted in our daily lives because we've become so, I guess it is even a form of institutionalization, technological institutionalization in society. We are so locked to our cell phones now. Everything we do, it's like a part of our body now. So to teach them that is really difficult. I just think in general, like, that's important for us to, like, you know, empower them as individuals to do things on their own, but we got to hold their hand along the way, unfortunately, you know, sometimes. But I think that's also a good thing too, because, you know, they feel safe with us. And once we develop that rapport with them, that I think also gives them the courage and the hope to kind of move forward. And also I tell them, like, if you struggle with something, ask questions. Ignorance is not stupidity. You just lack that knowledge. There's a lot of stuff I don't know. And that's, I think, one of my biggest things with my success is when I don't know something, I got 100 people that I can call that are professionals in different areas that I can rely on and say, hey, like Aaron, for instance, like, Aaron, tell me this about substance abuse. Tell me about this. How did you do this when you were working your nonprofit? Like, I can, you know, defer to the, you know, the expertise of other individuals that I trust, again, who kind of held my hand to teach me different pieces that I don't know. So I think that's just extremely important.
Absolutely. And I just think you raised such a good point about how there's so many things those of us who have been living sort of in the free world take for granted that at some point somebody helped us learn how to do. I think that's the thing that sometimes is forgotten, is that none of us are born with this knowledge. But for those of us who have had the privilege and the access to friends and family and communities and adults and teachers who along the way have sat with us and who have taught us and who have coached us and who have supported us to learn all of these skills, that's why we know these things now, and that everyone needs those supportive, thoughtful, caring helpers. And that for folks who've been incarcerated for a long time to really think about what are the things that have happened since that person went in. I remember I went to a resentencing hearing for a man I've been working with for a long time inside who's a juvenile lifer. He's coming home next month after 40 plus years. But the lawyer who represented him in this resentencing hearing, when he learned that he was effectively coming home, afterwards, she stepped out into the hall and was meeting with his family who had also attended the hearing, and I was out there, and she was basically starting to coach them a little bit. You know, everyone's hugging and crying and so exciting. And she was saying, this is one incredible hurdle that we have overcome together. And the work starts now as much as it ends. One part of this journey is ending today and one part is starting. And she just gave an example, you know, if you ask, you know, this man, I won't say his name, but if you ask him when he comes home to go to the store and buy milk, remember that the last time this man went to the store to buy milk was 40 years ago, and he was a teenager. And he's going to go in there and he's going to see oat milk and soy milk and pea milk and coconut milk, and it's going to be absolutely overwhelming. And so to just start prepping his support system, his family, to say, like, these are some of the things that we need to rally around him. And this was his lawyer, who was really phenomenal in that way. But absolutely, these teams of support and keeping in mind what has changed and that we all had people supporting us and learning these things at some point. So I think maybe we're just going to have time for one more question. Or Aaron, did you want to say something else?
Just send that guy my way. That's all I'm going to say.
I send everyone your way.
And real quick, the other thing that I you know, try to bring into whether it's substance abuse counseling or any other environment that I'm in a social work capacity or any other, is to really recognize and celebrate the fact that just about everybody I'm working with has been chewed up, has been spit out by the machine, has been traumatized by people who have sat in seats and had titles like mine. And so any hostility, any kind of disconnect, anything like that, to really embrace, you know, the space that we're in, that, you know, the potential connection. So.
Thank you, Aaron. So I'm just going to ask one more question directed towards Angie, and then we'll be about out of time for today. But the last question that came in I wanted to pose is just thinking about how COVID-19 has changed this work. And I know that you not only have been reporting extensively on how COVID has impacted incarcerated populations, but you've also been on the front lines reporting on the protests, and you've been reporting on returning folks who are coming home. So if you could just tell us a little bit about kind of where we're at in this particular moment with reentry.
Yeah, it's been a busy few months. And I was thinking, wow, we're already partly through August and I feel like I'm still stuck in March. So yeah, so I dove in pretty deeply into how COVID is impacting people who are incarcerated. We had a high number of outbreaks early on in the pandemic. They went down a bit, and it seems now the outbreaks are coming back again, unfortunately. But in thinking about, COVID, reentry, this movement that our country is in now, it really is a time where it feels to me like so much is changing, and that there's a lot of possibility for positive change that affects a lot of the folks that I write about. And I think that the people I write about are pretty conscious of that. And I feel that, underneath it all, people are pretty hopeful. And that some people feel like for the first time, the greater public is paying close attention to these systems that they've been a part of for so many decades. When I think about, my work with people in reentry, it's been different the last few months because prior to COVID, I was meeting people where they were at. I was going to their homes, their neighborhoods, their workplaces. I love to interview people in person to, see what they look like, how they carry themselves, hear how they talk. And to just get to know them on a one-on-one basis, especially when we're talking about these really deep, emotional, heavy issues. And so COVID has pretty much turned all of that, online or over the phone. I was, lucky to get to go to the summer camp that Erin hosted, and that was great because it was all outside, and I was able to, stay 6 feet apart or more. But for these other stories I've been working on, it's tough to only communicate with people over the phone. Especially if phone isn't their preferred method of communication, or if text messages are tricky for them too, if they're not the greatest at technology or just are frustrated by it. So for me as a journalist, I have to do that extra work to make people comfortable in these conversations that I'm having with them, and to try to accommodate them as much as I can, even with these restrictions due to COVID. Hopefully that answers the question. It's been a wild few months, but I think we're all sort of rolling with it and getting used to this new normal for now.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I've been part of a Facebook group that has hundreds of folks, and a lot of folks, I think you are all in it too, a lot of family members of incarcerated folks who have just been absolutely terrified during this time. Do you want to add something, Angie?
Yeah, so I think I joined that Facebook group when maybe a week into the pandemic, and I was realizing this could be really bad for our prisons here in Michigan. And there were some times I was fielding calls from, 5, 6, 7 people a day who are terrified. They're crying, they're angry, they're frustrated, rightfully so, because there was so much unknown. And I think now there's a little bit more that's known, but I'm still getting messages from people saying, this is happening at my loved one's prison, and you have answers to this. And so, I'm trying the best I can to get them the right information, which isn't always easy. And I'm, trying as much as I can to be a voice for them, but also to be a voice for people coming out of prison. So for me, there's, a bit more of a balance as I'm talking more to families of people who are currently incarcerated, and talking to people who are incarcerated themselves too, over JPay and phone calls. So I think now I'm just doing a lot more work than I was, but I feel very lucky to be here in this position.
Yeah, and I will just add, I think you're doing a heroic effort because so many people are looking to you as somebody who does have some access to folks in the department, or, they see you as somebody who might be able to get information that they just so desperately need, and they're in such a state of fear and grief over their loved one's health and safety. And I don't envy your position. It seems stressful, but I admire all of the work you're doing, and I know you have felt like a lifeline to so many folks who just want to know that there's a connection, and somebody is raising their concerns and sounding the alarm that we need to keep the folks inside and the folks coming home safe.
Oh, I so appreciate that. Thank you. It's an honor really to be able to communicate with all these folks, families, people who are incarcerated, and people coming home.
All right, y'all. So it's about that time. Thank you so much for all of your insights and your wisdom, for sharing your stories. For folks who are attending, you will receive a short survey after the webinar ends, and we'd be really grateful if you'd fill it out. Let us know what you learned, how we can improve events like this in the future. And you'll also receive a follow-up email within the week with the recording, as well as some additional links to organizations that were spoken about today. We can link to some of Angie's amazing work. And if you want to put something in the survey, if there's other resources that you would like, I will read all of those surveys and do our very best to share those resources in the follow-up email. Oh, Erin just shared a whole lot of stuff. Fantastic. All righty. So thank you so much again for everyone for joining today. And hopefully I will see you all sometime soon. Until then, take care. Bye.